SoCal chapter, and I'm based in Coney Island, also known as San Diego. And we're so happy to be here and present to you our class against Imperialist Feminism. I'm going to start us off this evening. The Revolutionary Feminist Committee is a militant, anti-imperialist, and proletarian feminist organization of nationally oppressed and gender-oppressed working people based in the United States. We aim to organize nationally oppressed and gender-oppressed working people into the struggle for liberation, for dismantling imperialism, capitalism, and sexual commodification. We stand for national liberation, women's emancipation, and for a society free of class exploitation. Our roots go back to the National Democratic Movement in the Philippines, which is also home to the longest ongoing communist revolution in the world. Although no longer formally affiliated with the ND movement, we stand in solidarity with the struggle against imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucratic capitalism. We have local committees across the West Coast, the East Coast, and South. Our committees are engaged in political education, like here tonight, campaigning, and organizing the masses of nationally and gender-oppressed people in struggle. Okay, so just the overview for this evening. We're going to have the introduction of RC, which we did, Introduction to Feminism, Feminism and Imperialism, current examples of science in feminism, the antidote of proletarian feminism, and then we'll finish off with the discussion. So also we'd like to introduce ourselves individually. Again, I'm Gabby.
I'm Tommy. I kind of started out in the Bay Area chapter, and now since I moved to LA for school, I'm based out here now. I'm a cadre member of the Revolutionary Feminist.
Hi, I'm Shanice. I'm from the San Diego chapter.
I'm Jackie, the coordinator for the LA chapter.
And Esperanza with the LA chapter.
All right, so I'm going to get us started today with the overview of feminist trends. You can change the slide. Most are familiar with the categorization of feminism in the West into three waves. In the philosophical trends and the feminist movement, Anuradha Gandhi states that there are two phases of feminism. Phase one took place between the mid-19th centuries to the 1920s. This phase is most notable for the suffragette movement and the Seneca Falls Convention. During this time, democratic ideology was on the rise, as well as the capitalist mode of production. In this phase, women were involved with organizing around the abolition of slavery. Women were met with hostility within the abolition movement, which made them reflect on their own subjugated status in society. Many of them understood the dialectical nature between abolition and women's rights. Here, women gained skills in organizing in the political arena. After slavery was abolished, women started organizing around their status in society. Unfortunately, some of the same women who organized around abolition fell to individualism and rallied against the 14th Amendment, the amendment that gave Black men the right to vote. It is important to note that a lot of the suffragettes were middle class to upper class women who had access to education and organizing spaces in general. Some of the suffragettes even advocated for limiting the vote to educated women and women in a certain class. Here, we start to see where liberal feminism left behind Black women and minorities as well. It was the socialist and communist women who rejected the demand for the vote being limited to those with property and broadened the demand to include vote for all women, including working class women. They organized separate mass mobilizations in support of the demand for the women's right to vote. Liberal feminists during this time lobbied with politicians in order to get the right to vote. Some of those politicians were extremely racist, but since these politicians served the bourgeois feminist interests, they did not care. In fact, a lot of them were racist themselves. While the suffragette movement was occurring, the labor movement was also growing. Many garment workers were working extremely long hours for low pay. This included immigrant, white, and Black working class women. At first, women were left out of the labor movement. Only the IWW supported efforts to organize working women. Anarchists, Marxists, and socialists organized amongst the workers. The suffragettes paid no interest in the exploitation of workers and did not support their movement, which is to no surprise. The women's movement paused during the Great Depression and the rise of fascism. Women took up jobs to keep the economy afloat, but were encouraged to give them up to uphold the patriarchal family structure. This post-war phase ended, and the Black Civil Rights Movement gained more momentum, followed by the anti-war movement, which leads us to phase 2. Next slide. So this is colloquially known as the second and third wave. There's social unrest with the Black Civil Rights Movement and the anti-war movement, as mentioned. There's a cultural revolution in China that had an impact on the West. With the increase in political activity among students, radical feminist movement emerged. Socialist/Marxist feminists and radical feminists shared a vision about revolution, both trying to revise Marxism. Radical feminists rejected the liberal view that reforming laws would solve women's oppression and believed that the entire structure of society had to be transformed. After 1975, there was a shift towards cultural feminism. This is where radical feminism kind of has its split. And in the 90s, feminists were influenced by postmodernism. Next slide. All right. Although there are many trends in feminism, I'll be focusing on liberal feminism, radical feminism, cultural feminism, and postmodern feminism, as it relates to the current pinkwashing in reaction to the Israeli occupation of Palestine. The trend of liberal thought emerged during the Enlightenment in the 17th century with the end of the feudal system. It will become the ideology of the rising bourgeoisie. Instead of power and superiority being innate, liberal philosophy proclaimed that human beings are naturally equal. The glaring contradiction was that white male bourgeoisie liberal philosophers failed to apply women to their philosophy, as well as people of color. And they also failed to apply their liberal philosophy to the patriarchal family and women's position in it. And this is where the rise of liberal feminism comes in. There were no black women in attendance at the Seneca Falls Convention. The suffragists modeled the Declaration of Independence when drafting the Declaration of Sentiments. We all know the saying, all men are created equal. They included all men and women are created equal. The men who wrote the Declaration of Independence did not stand on what they said. They did not extend their rights to those who are poor and oppressed. This is exactly what liberal feminists did. Some of the main characteristics of liberal feminism are a strong emphasis on individual rights and autonomy, being heavily focused on equality and opportunity and social mobility. It is reformist, as in it works within the capitalist system to try to make material change. And oftentimes, the change liberal feminists make is symbolic and oftentimes performative. Personally, I feel like liberal feminists are more concerned with appearing socially moral rather than shaking the ground. Some critiques. Focus on the individual rather than the collective. It is ahistorical and does not have a principled analysis and understanding of the women's role in history or have an analysis of our subjugation. Does not acknowledge the material conditions of working class people, and that is why it mainly benefits bourgeois women. I went into detail about the suffragette movement because they were considered liberal feminists. So Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they prioritized their own class interest, fought for individual rather than collective, lobbied with politicians to gain access to vote, and ignored the working class women's movement. Liberal feminists at this time did not have a critique on the capitalist system that exploited their working class siblings. Just as their four-sisters, liberal feminists today have been turning their back on working class women. But in this case, it's in the name of diversity and inclusion. We see political figures such as Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, AOC, and others be propped up and praised. Liberals see progressive women in power as a win, as if representation matters more than material change in our society. They cannot make the connection that these type of women are part of a system that helps exploit the marginalized women they say they care so much about. Also, these women are complacent and the active participants in the many atrocities that the United States commits. Same goes for praising women, LGBT people, and minorities for being CEOs, while they steal their employees' labor value and collaborate with the ruling class to further the demise of the working class people. Liberals are unable to recognize that contradiction. Next slide. On to radical feminism. It formed in the second phase, where there was a social unrest in regards to the Black Civil Rights Movement and the anti-war movement. The distinction between radical feminists and liberal feminism is that radical feminists believe ultimately that the structure of society needs to be transformed. Later on, as the radical feminist movement became strong, Marxism was cast aside and the entire emphasis shifted from an analysis of sex and gender system, de-linked from the exploitative capitalist system. Their analysis of the origin of women's oppression is not in line with the historical material analysis. There are many prominent radical feminist texts that give an insight on their ideology, such as Sexual Politics and the Dialectics of Sex. Many of you all heard the saying, the personal is political. This comes from Sexual Politics. In short, that phrase is saying that many of the problems that women are facing in their personal life are not individual failings, but are due to the patriarchal structure of our society. Although there's a lot of truth in that statement, it is not as simple as that. In this text, Millet argues that the male-female relationship is a framework for all power relationships in society. This power relationship supersedes all other forms of inequality, whether racial, political, or economic. Another popular text amongst radical feminists is The Dialectics of Sex, which claims that the origins of women's subordination and man's domination lay in the reproductive roles of men and women. This counters what Engels had written about historical materialism. Instead of the economic development and changes in mode of production being the great moving power in history that divided society into classes, it's biological sex that developed two classes and then developed into an economic class system. And this analysis just completely ignores men exploiting other men and women gaining political power and exploiting men as well. By linking women's oppression solely to our reproductive role, it ignores the material and social causes of our oppression. Since women's reproductive role is biological and can't be changed, it gives a notion that our oppression is fixed, essentially naturalizing our oppression. All right, focus on the cultural features. Cultural feminism is focused on the cultural features of patriarchal oppression and primarily aimed for reforms in this area. Cultural feminism is similar to radical feminism as it veers towards separatism and bioessentialism. They claim that men and women are basically different. Claiming that traits are innately feminine or masculine does not take into account our social upbringing. It is also just blatantly untrue. This depiction of men being naturally violent and brute without bringing into consideration of class and social upbringing is detrimental to revolution. We cannot be liberated without the help of working class men and have to collaborate with them, collaborate with them. On the other hand, saying women are innately nonviolent is absurd. There are plenty of women who have blood on their hands. Women are capable and are currently active participants in genocide. Saying that women are naturally nonviolent also discourages women from being militant and fighting their oppressors. Cultural feminism does not have a critique on capitalism, and often they believe that patriarchy and capitalism are two separate systems. To them, the main contradiction in our society is a relationship between men and women. Like radical feminism, their analysis is not based in historical materialism. Today, we are seeing people justify genocide by using claims that are ahistorical and lack depth. They are also using bioessentialist arguments to justify the killings of Palestinians. Another thing I want to touch on is a belief that some cultural feminists have that making changes in your personal lifestyle, such as only dating women or creating alternative families, single-handedly is going to overthrow patriarchy. They are too focused on the cultural relationship between men and women and do not fight to end oppression that causes material strife for the nationally oppressed people. And I have that picture of Cara Delevingne, which I won't say what's on her shirt, but a lot of these like celebrity feminists really just mean ending their, they're not about taking down the upper class, the ruling class. They're about the cultural aspects of feminism, and them themselves are active participants in an exploitation of women. And some critiques, it naturalizes women's subordination, does not critique capitalists, and is often idealist. Next slide. All right, on to postmodernism. Postmodern feminists focus on deconstruction of language, believe that language constructs reality and can lead to subjectivism. To them, ideas precede material conditions. Postmodern feminism gives relative importance to identity without any theoretical framework to understand the historical reasons for identity formation and to link the various identities. They emphasize the concept of women as the other, so basically the non-dominated or dominating caste in society. At times, postmodern feminist groups identify women as a single homogeneous category, devoid of class and social analysis, erasing our class and racial distinction. Women are not one homogeneous group. There are poor women, there are witch women, there are black women. To get even more in depth, there are black bourgeoisie women. So it's basically the negative side effects of identity politics. Instead of fighting against the root of exploitation and oppression in our society, they look at problems such as racism, homophobia, genocide, and sex-based discrimination as isolated events that need to be tackled separately. So basically not having a dialectical outlook. Some critiques, when we focus solely on identity, it divides us and makes mass mobilization harder. We need to understand the dialectical nature of our oppression across identity. This trend of thinking makes women a homogeneous group, delinking class struggle from the women's movement, encompasses the negative effects of identity politics. Our enemies use identity politics as a way to master oppression. We see it happening right now with the Zionist occupation. They are currently using women and LGBT people as shields for their genocide. In my comments later, we'll get more into detail.
Thank you, Shanice. So, Shanice did an overview of the feminist trends, the philosophical trends of feminism. I'm going to begin to define imperialist feminism and imperialism itself. So our presentation is going to be building upon previous concepts mentioned in a true Marxist fashion. So according to Marx, well, as individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and how they produce. So basically, our social and political systems should be understood through the lens of our economic mode of production. So we understand that current mode of production to be capitalism. And about the history of, a brief mention of the history of capitalism. So it emerged from the womb of feudalism and was an advancement compared to feudalism. So basically, under feudalism, the means of production and land rights were owned by the nobility and the monarchy, who received this power through the divine right of kings. And the contradictions of feudalism gave way to capitalism, in which the nobility and monarchy were replaced by the bourgeois class, who rose to power in the 18th century. The nobility were replaced by the ruling class. Serfdom was replaced by wage labor. Property came into the hands of the wealthy instead of the nobility. So this transition from feudalism to capitalism was fueled by a concept touched upon by Shanice, which is a liberalism. And to expand on it, it was a political philosophy characterized by individual freedom, democracy, right to property. So I mention this again because it's really important to know, because it informs our concept of imperialist feminism. So I'm going to define imperialism. In Marx's Das Kapital, he explains that capitalism has an inherent need to expand and reproduce itself within an area with finite resources. So it seeks to acquire new resources in order to make more profit. And this process gives way to imperialism. So according to Lenin, in his text, imperialism the highest stage of capitalism? He describes that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. So, quote, if it were necessary to give the briefest possible definition of imperialism, this is Lenin, we should have to say that imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism. So imperialism is capitalism in its most depraved state. It's a result of capitalism's inherent contradictions between the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and the need to generate more profit. That's the internal contradiction. And then the external contradiction, which is between the capitalist firms fighting over limited resources. So Lenin describes several stages of the birth of imperialist nations, like our own. So first, there's monopoly capitalism, and it's between it's domestic competition. Then the competition is between capitalist countries, and then these capitalist countries form alliances like NATO and the United Nations, Five Eyes. They're all examples of imperialist alliances. So, through imperialism, the rich capitalist nations are able to delay their final crisis based on the ever-heightening contradictions. So, they keep the poor, overexploited nations underdeveloped and in debt, and dependent on the capitalist nations for manufactured goods, jobs, and financial resources. So this fact is why imperialism operates alongside oppressive militarism, war and plunder, and a bourgeois dictatorship. So imperialism must be disrupted to liberate humankind from its death grip. So now to explain imperialist feminism. So we have to define bourgeois feminism. So basically, every idea in our society has a class character. And feminism too, like Shanice was saying, has a class character too. So bourgeois feminism, whether it's liberal or radical, ultimately maintains the current exploitative order. So throughout all these streams of feminism, they fail to name the root cause of women's oppression, which is the class contradiction. And all these feminisms seek to unite women across class, which, as Alexandra Kollontai points and others have pointed out, always ends in favor of bourgeois women at the expense of working class women. So, back to imperialist feminism. It is a coalescence of bourgeois feminism and imperialism. Bourgeois feminism believes that in order to emancipate women from patriarchy, we must support all women, regardless of their class affiliation. So I want to discuss current examples that we hear in liberal circles that advance this imperialist feminist rhetoric. And it's arguments about men's nature. We see this a lot with the Palestinian, the occupation of Palestine, demonizing Arab men, and like Shanice discussed this as well, men being naturally violent. They justify imperialist wars by invoking women's rights or women's leadership. So other examples of the left advancing this imperialist feminist is mixing radical feminist ideas, the post-modern framework, all things that Shanice had touched upon. So a modern day example of imperialist feminism, and this is probably the root of it in our modern times, was during the 9/11 era, when Laura Bush, the lovely Laura Bush, she commented on during the occupation of Afghanistan, which was an imperialist war, justified as being a war on terror, right? So she stated that only, quote, only terrorists and the Taliban pull out women's fingernails for wearing nail polish. So Laura Bush connected misogyny to terrorism noting the fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women. So these comments, kind of what are the roots of this modern idea of imperialist feminism. So it was popularized during the 9/11 era, and it led to a ton of projects, but there was this one project in Afghanistan called Beauty Without Borders, and it was actually funded by L'Oreal, which is a Zionist company, and in war-torn Afghanistan, they opened like a beauty school, and they were trying to bring like beautician skills to Afghan women, and the idea was to empower women with beautician schools and access to cosmetic products to combat male oppression. So this is basically to expand capitalism, right? They just want a new market to sell their beauty products. I mean, essentially, and this was 9/11 era. 9/11 era's idea of like of women's liberation. So this ignores the primary contradiction of the settler state, that of the colonizer versus the colonized. It prioritizes the contradiction between men and women. So what the Palestinian struggle for liberation has shown us is that women cannot be liberated until all oppressed classes and colonized peoples are liberated. So essentially, these settler colonies prioritize the idea of they prioritize the idea of women's rights versus oppressed people's lives. So we know that in settler states, they're still patriarchally structured. So it's not like we're any freer under in a settler state than we are marginally more free than in like a semi-feudal state, but that's because of our oppression of semi-feudal states. So also what the Palestinian struggle has shown us is like women like Layla Khaled are at the forefront of the resistance. So women are the resistance, like we are resistance fighters. And Layla Khaled said, quote, "I learned that a woman could be a fighter, an activist, a wife, and a mother." So I also want to reference our critique of our political critique, which is entitled "Tear Feminism Out of the Hands of the Colonizer." So at the beginning after Al-Aqsa flood, we saw in the media these stories of like mass rape, and it was like they were saying that the Palestinian resistance by the Intifada were mass raping, and none of these claims were substantiated. There was no real evidence. The evidence was like a video of a woman with blood on her shorts, and then an image of a woman lying in a truck, and like that was supposed to prove that there was mass rape. So they were unsubstantiated claims that overshadow the history of sexual violence imposed on Palestinians by the Zionist entity. So the Zionist entity, just like other colonial entities, kind of advanced their imperialism through rape, and we'll discuss that further in the presentation. So the allegations of rape at the hands of Palestinian freedom fighters are unsubstantiated, and we refuse to allow the imperialist media to weaponize feminism at the service of a genocidal settler colony. So my last example of imperialist feminism was when radical feminist Catherine McKinnon, she was asked about rape as a war crime and in the context of genocide. And McKinnon said that she said that, quote, "The Israeli army does not rape." She said, "I spoke to Palestinian women, and they testified that there are no attacks of rape by Israeli soldiers." That is absolutely not true. And this these sexual crimes of like sexual violence by the Zionist entity isn't just against women. There's actually a lot of the men who are coming out of imprisonment from occupied Palestine are saying that they were raped, they were threatened with rape. I mean, these people are fucking sick, and they're psychologically tortured. They engage in a lot of, I'm sure we've all seen stories of like very bizarre sexual crimes, and like they're also so obsessed with, this is a tangent, like this idea of spreading the master race, and we see this obsession with their like their semen and stuff, and like them using cow prongs to remove semen from dead soldiers, just like really sick shit. And these are all characteristics of the ways like the settler states dominate. So on that note, I'm gonna pass it to Tommy.
Salam everyone. How's everyone doing?
Doing all right.
Okay, cool. So at this section, I think what I'm trying to do is discuss how imperialist feminism manifests in everyday social media context. So in particular, what we're going to do is sort of do a meta-analysis of tweets that appear on X or Twitter. And, you know, I'm not going to get too academic, but I definitely want to build up on concepts that we already discussed and also connect it to this, connect it to other ideas. And so, also I wanted to say that all of the tweets that we're going to mention here can be analyzed for like 15 minutes each, but we're going to just touch on each of them for a little. But yeah, just know that like the Zionist feminism appears everywhere, and we just wanted to give some examples of how it specifically appears in the context of social media. So there's two goals of Zionist feminism that I've worked to identify. One is to basically deflect attention from the Zionist entity's own anti-feminist violence. So I just wanted to say that the Zionist project is inherently anti-feminist, and in this context we're talking about the feminism that we practice as the Revolutionary Feminist Committee. Zionism really stands juxtaposed to the liberation of women, queer people, and gender-oppressed people in general. And a lot of the Zionist feminist goals are basically to, pretend like they're not engaged in that anti-feminist violence. The second goal that I wanted to talk about is how, Zionist feminism is used to achieve Zionist anti-Palestinian imperialist political ends. So, it's not only in order to deflect its own attention, but to justify what it's doing to Palestinians in order to fill Southern colonial, political ends. And we'll discuss this further. And yeah, you'll also note that a lot of what we see, the saying is going around on social media about how every accusation is a confession. So that piece we'll talk about, and then we'll also go a little deeper. So the first trend, which we kind of already touched on, is rape as a weapon. And when I say rape as a weapon, there's two things happening. One of them is obviously how rape and sexual violence is used by Zionist soldiers against Palestinians, and another is basically to delegitimize the Palestinian cause and justify colonialism by making accusations of sexual assault, anti-feminism, and rape. So we can see feminism also as a weapon in these tweets, and so it's kind of hard to see on the screen, but the leftmost tweet says, it's from the quote-unquote Israel Women's Network, and it says, the international feminist community turned their backs on victims of sexual assault by Hamas. The second tweet discusses about, there's a lot going on there, but I think we can talk about just the hashtags that they use. One of them, it says, Me Too Unless You're a Jew, and they created a website with a petition, which I don't really know what it does, but it's basically, serves to make, not only make claims of anti-Semitism, but make claims of violence against women, and these things of believe Israeli women. They also created this dictionary, definition, feminicist, where a woman, and the definition says a woman who claims to support women's rights unless Jewish women are brutally violated, raped, and slaughtered in a ISIS way by Hamas. So it's beyond wild, but we can see multiple trends here. One of them is about it's really Islamophobic. To be upfront, it pushes out this theory that all political Islam is the same, and and it's most foremost anti-Palestinian. The right one, I think you can see a manifestation of both things. This was recently. This wasn't in our past presentation, but over the weekend in LA, there were these Zionists that basically one of them dressed up as kind of a stereotypical Palestinian resistance fighter, and they were parading around this woman who's bloodied, and specifically it's period blood, which is interesting as a statement. And so they walked around basically trying to say that nobody cares, that Zionist women are being violated. They also make accusations. These heinous crimes persist while women's rights activists remain silent. Where are you? They urgently need your help. Don't stay silent. And they tag UN Women, National Now, which is a women's organization in the U.S. And they also at the United Nations. So one can see here how feminism is duly used as a means to delegitimize the Palestinian cause, and also to just basically to deflect from the actual rape and sexual violence that the Zionist entity is doing. Next slide, please. So this is also a lot. So we can focus on this here. So this is another thread that I identify, which is this homo-colonialism and transphobia. We can call this pinkwashing, and I just want to say that pinkwashing connects really to feminism, because it's this manifestation of liberal feminism and bourgeois feminism coming together. And I keep talking about this, but every accusation is a confession. There are documented, anti-queer, anti-trans violence that comes from the Zionist entity. You read horrible stories of gay Zionist soldiers killing queer Palestinians. You also hear how queer Palestinians are blackmailed, and there was a recent project as a geographer. There's people doing these story maps of when queer Palestinians are sharing their stories about how they're literally getting bombed and killed, and are just waiting until they meet their loved ones again. And so we can start talking about these tweets now. The one at the leftmost side says, "Liberation, the first ever pride flag is raised in Gaza." Number one, that's not true, but anyway. Under Hamas, being gay means death. And basically they wanted to send a message of hope, see his story below, to Gaza's hidden LGBTQ plus community, stay hopeful of a future where you can live and love free of Hamas. So there's this live and love freely thing is this manifestation of liberal feminism. There's also, what's going on here is that the pride flag is being used to justify imperialism, which is, I just want to say, the pride flag isn't necessarily even juxtaposed to imperialism in this context. The second tweet is also pretty horrible. It depicts a Zionist woman and a hijabi woman who's supposed to be Palestinian. And it says, "Humankind beyond faith and base," which I also don't really know what that means, but what this is trying to do is promote this idea of how I don't know, a secularist, like atheist ideology is somehow the antidote to the what's happening in Palestine. So this is not only Islamophobic, but in general, like anti-Palestinian, by like desecularizing and delegitimizing, Islam being used as a political force to liberate Palestine. And then the last post depicts person who they claim is transgender and says like the fact that the Islamists didn't lynch like this person, it sounds astounding to me. So basically there's this projection of how a person who they see as a trans woman is coming to a pro-Palestinian rally, and they're like surprised that Muslims didn't go up and like commit violence against her. And so what this also says is that they want trans and queer people to die, and they only see trans and queer people as political tools in order to promote Zionist ideology and also to cover up Zionist violence. Okay, the next slide is this third trend, which I describe as tears. So in all of these tweets, there are women crying. I think the rightmost tweet kind of, I think, articulates how tears are used. It says you don't have to be Jewish to stand up for Israel. You just have to be human. So not only is this language of liberal, feminism, but there's also this aspect of cultural feminism where, tears are used, and it connects to bioessentialism by basically saying that like the tears of women are more legitimate than Palestinian resistance, and that somehow these tears of Zionist women should be put above whether it's like the tears of Palestinian women, whether it's the violence, counter-violence, justified, glorious violence of the Palestinian resistance, and basically it makes women out to be in this role of like victimhood, as if women also cannot commit violence, and as if the Zionist woman crying is somehow should be taken more seriously than what Palestinians are doing to resist Zionist occupation. So that's like the third trend that we identified, and in general, it's basically used as a means to detract from what the Zionist entity is doing. This fourth trend that we identified, I think you've probably seen it all over social media. It's what I kind of describe as this idea called Israeli defensive fetishism, which it's not really a worked out concept that I've developed yet, but in general, it uses the politics and construction of beauty and is a form of cultural feminism in order to, I don't know, basically detract from this violence. And, there's elements of commodification and misogyny within all of these narratives of how, like, and also bioessentialism, where it says, like, if you've seen, like, this idea of, like, Zionism is sexy, or, like, how basically beautiful women cannot, are not capable of, harming innocent civilians. And basically it says that, like it constructs beauty in the eye of Zionism, and it also works to, basically say that like, oh yeah, women are incapable of any like illegitimate violence. And all of these women, whether it's Gal Gadot being pictured as, Wonder Woman, whether it's like an IDF soldier, whether it's even like people who were killed, by Zionists on October 7th, we can see that how this is baked into everyday propaganda of like beauty and sort of this commodification of women being used to say that like, number one, that Palestinians and their cause is not beautiful. Another one is that, like, another one is saying that only beautiful women can be victims of sexual violence, and it just is this like really like fucked up way of constructing, you know, um, and legitimizing Zionism, and it also serves as a recruitment, a recruitment strategy for men and Zionist men who want to join in the violence, where they see the way of like joining, the military and acting as like, colonizers as a way to gain access to more women. And in general, all of this serves, the victims of whom are Palestinians. And I don't know, all of these four trends in particular are used again again, the two goals that I discussed. One of them is to detract from the anti-feminist violence that the Zionist entity practices. And the second one is to fulfill imperialist means and justify their colonialism, and work to, at the end of the day, oppress Palestinians. And I hope that all of this, in particular, showed that Zionist women are capable of violence. That Palestinian men are victims of this, are victims of Zionism. Palestinian men fulfill, feminist goals, as we'll discuss with our feminism that we practice. And in general, we just want to tell you all that this is how it manifests and how we must combat every single way that even in this like everyday like discursive cultural way that Zionism manifests itself, that we need to combat that. So yeah, in general, that's what I wanted to discuss, and then we're going to move on to discuss. Yeah, I mean, we can discuss the Finkelstein video. I mean, it's really famous, and this happened in 2008 when the siege on Gaza was happening, and Norman Finkelstein, who's an anti-Zionist Jewish professor, this woman who's pictured in the center basically was crying and was just like, and was just being like, what about these like, what about our lives? What about Israelis or whatever? And Norman Finkelstein, who we can have opinions about, but basically Finkelstein was like, don't use these like crocodile tears to legitimize Zionism, and basically don't use the Holocaust as a means to and he's basically also invoking his own like story as a descendant of Holocaust survivors, to basically say like these tears, this this discursive like anti-Semitism does not trump at all what's happening in Palestine. So yeah, all of these trends all are ways that we like. They're not only recent right now on social media, we can see them over time, but these are just the most recent manifestations of it, and I think we'll see it evolve over time. And in general, as I said, all of these forms of Zionism, even if they appear on social media, need to be combated, and Palestinians need to be centered, and Palestinian resistance needs to be legitimized over all of this Zionist noise that's happening.
Yeah, so we wanted to now go into, what is the antidote, or what is the counter to this kind of like imperialist feminism, this ruling class feminism that really is an extremely destructive force when it comes to any, revolutionary movement, any national liberation movement, and that also plays on the sympathies that we have, especially as like progressives or as the left, for women's rights or LGBT rights or whatever, and uses that to siphon off support from the resistance. So our answer to that would be that we want to combat this imperialist ruling class feminism and instead propagate a proletarian feminism. So the woman here is a fighter in the New People's Army of the NPA, which is currently advancing the longest ongoing communist revolution in the world. And so, as Jackie mentioned, we included a quote from Alexandra Kollontai, who was actually the first woman in a government cabinet in the Soviet Union, and I think arguably around any comparable state at that time. And what she points out here, which is something that's really important to us, is that the liberal feminists, but even how feminism is framed today. Like I went to Whittier College down the street and took a lot of feminist theory classes, and a lot of it is framed with like equality with men, right? And even if they don't say it like that, that's sort of the end conclusion that we can draw from their type of feminism. But as Kollontai pointed out long ago, what would equal rights mean with men? If all the women in this room today, we snapped our finger and everyone had equal rights with men, under a capitalist system, under imperialism, all that would mean is that we would all get an equal share in inequality and exploitation. So the women's movement cannot think that equality with men is the end goal, much less even necessarily an important goal, although we'll address some important reforms maybe later. But not only that, but there's also maybe more of a dubious side to it, which is that it would also mean sort of new, unprecedented rights and privileges for women in the ruling class, right? So they don't want necessarily equality for the working women in this room with working men. They want equality for the ruling class women with the men in their own class, right? They want the same right to be CEOs, to steal the labor value from workers, to loot Latin America, Africa, etc. So we firmly oppose that. And then just before moving on, I'll say that we include some photos such as this fighter from the NPA, but these people do not necessarily identify as proletarian feminists, but we believe that through our definition of proletarian feminism, we unite politically in the substance of our politics with these people that we use. So the first thing is, as Jackie and Shanice mentioned earlier, right, there's many trends in feminism, like you might hear, liberal feminism, radical feminism, cultural feminism, ecofeminism. There's, postmodern feminism. There's so many, right? But in the end of the day, all ideas in a class society can be understood through the lens of a class analysis, because all ideas in a class society are stamped with the class that they originate from and with the class that they serve. So when we look at different feminist trends or different ideas about women's liberation, we always have to ask the question of for who? Who exactly does this serve? And we can understand that what we would call bourgeois feminism, it's in service of ruling class women. It intends to increase their rights and privileges at the expense of the majority of women who are working women, but also nationally oppressed women, right? And so we also see this, for example, with settler feminism. It aims to advance the rights of women who are citizens of the settler colony against the rights and even the very existence of women who are indigenous or who are oppressed by the settler colony. So when we look at all these different forms of feminism, we always have to try to understand the class nature of them, right? So I guess I'll just start out. So what is a definition of proletarian feminism? So it really is simply an abbreviation or just another way of saying the Marxist or the Maoist line on the women's question. And it is important for us to say this because this feminism, this understanding of women's emancipation stems not from the academy, not from Harvard, not from Whittier College, but from a revolutionary struggle, right? From the process of organizing women into struggle, organizing them into militant mass organizations, into revolutionary struggle, etc., and learning from that, right? Understanding the conditions of women and how women can actually get free. What proletarian feminism is not is sort of an attempt to say, well, Marxism is sort of incomplete around the women's question, right? So instead, what we need to do is pull from all these different feminisms and then mix it up like it's a soup, or like a buffet. And and it's also not an ideology separate from the revolutionary movement, right? It's a line that comes from the revolutionary movement. But I do want to say that, we don't seek to sort of throw away the progress that has been made on the women's question. What we want to do is apply Marxism, or really revolutionary theory, which is what that is, to the experience of women and trans people in order to develop our own independent theory of the women's and trans movement. So some points on why we find this term useful. Number one, because it represents our desire to arouse, organize, and mobilize the different sectors facing gender-based oppression, which includes women, trans people, and non-binary people. But we don't just seek to organize them for anything, but specifically in service of proletarian revolution, of national liberation, of a complete transformation of our society at its base. Secondly, because we think that it can draw people into struggle who identify with feminism, who are agitated for whatever reasons due to their own history around issues that specifically revolve around gender, right? So this term allows us to connect with those people and organize them, right? And then it also represents our desire to propagate a proletarian line, which is basically a line that represents the interests of working people, nationally oppressed people, against the ruling class line on women and feminism. And specifically, as we went over earlier, this statement or this term really comes from Maria Tegi's thesis that there are three main types of feminism: bourgeois, which is like ruling class, petty bourgeois, and then proletarian or working feminism, right? And for those who don't know, Maria Tegi was a Peruvian communist, and he wrote a lot of good things. So you should maybe check his stuff out. So we would defend this by saying that our history, the history of working class people and our struggles, really proves the correctness of a revolutionary line on the women's question. If you look throughout history, the advances in women's struggle were made primarily through communist women and their proletarian male comrades, right? Look at all of the main advances towards, not only our understanding of women's oppression, but even towards women's emancipation. That was all made in periods of revolutionary struggle and socialist construction. Also, another thing that is often missed, even when you take these feminist theory classes, is the role that Engels played in understanding women's condition. Before Engels, there was no understanding that women's oppression was historical. The understanding was that women's oppression stemmed from her biology, which unfortunately some radical feminists are trying to resurrect now, even though radical feminism initially was a reaction against that, right? But Engels was the first to historicize women's oppression and move beyond biological explanation. And then also because the question on women's emancipation has been a central focus throughout our entire revolutionary history, right? So you know that Engels had an analysis on women, the family, and private property. You know that during socialist construction in the USSR, Lenin, Kollontai, even Clara Zetkin, continued to advance our understanding of women's emancipation and what the position of the communist movement should be towards that. And then later on, we see, Mao is responsible for this very quote, "Women hold up half the sky," right? We see Gandhi, Maria Tegi, even the National Democratic Movement in the Philippines, producing this incredibly deep theoretical work on this question that's based on their real practice of organizing working women, nationally oppressed women, into struggle. And so the way we see it is that class analysis deepens rather than limits our ability to organize women into struggle and to understand the real root cause of women's oppression. So you might also hear these words like socialist feminism or Marxist feminism. So it is maybe necessary for us to differentiate. And again, people might use these words colloquially, but we're not really talking about that. We're more talking about how these names emerged as like a feminist trend, right? So people probably will use this term but not agree with this. But socialist and Marxist feminisms were developed as academic trends or as attempts to sort of revise revolutionary theory by mixing it with bourgeois feminist lines. And sometimes I worry, right, that people are like, oh no, but is this being dogmatic that you don't want to do that? But in my opinion, after October 7th, you really do see how this can play a very negative and disorganizing role among the left. Because if you're not able to understand what the primary contradiction is in a given situation, if you're not able to understand the root of women's oppression in a country, in a nation like Palestine, or in a semi-feudal nation, or in an oppressed nation, then it makes it very easy to turn class antagonisms into gender antagonisms, and take an antagonism between the occupier and the occupied and turn it into an antagonism between men and women. So that's why I think it is very important that we talk about this. Also, both socialist and Marxist feminisms generally consider the development in, Marxist or revolutionary theory incomplete, and argue that we need to revise it with these sort of class-devoid feminist theories, right? So again, is it dogmatism to say that? So I would say no, right? Unlike dogmatism, a sort of principled stance on this would take the truths that are proven through practice and oppose attempts to sort of abandon those fundamental tenets of revolutionary theory. Instead, bringing in, political lines that serve the enemy class, right? Which in this case is sort of the Zionist entity, the U.S. imperialist state, etc. But that doesn't mean that we want to ignore the different trends in feminism, even if they are bourgeois or ruling class, right? And the reason why is because we could look at everything, including feminist trends, and divide them into two. What is true on one side, what is revolutionary, and then on the other side, what is incorrect, and what is counter-revolutionary. And so in doing that, we're able to study these things and sort of synthesize them, right, and understand them. And, this has also really been learned through practice. So, for example, we see in the Philippines where some women cadre were embracing socialist feminism around a certain period, which led to cross-class coalitions, which downplayed class contradictions, the surrender of the leadership of working people, specifically working women, to capitalist women, as well as supporting landlord compradors like Aquino, right, because they were women and so-called liberal Democrats, as well as, very importantly, separating the woman question from the general social question, right, which it's just not. And we'll go over in a second how women's oppression originated alongside class oppression and how it's maintained by class oppression, and therefore you cannot separate it, right? And so here, we talk a little bit, or we include a quote, right, on women in revolution, which was during a time where the revolution in the Philippines was really rectifying a lot of the errors that they identified, right? And so, you see that they were sort of referring to Marxism as orthodox, and finding that Marxism was wanting on the women's question, but importantly, without engaging in a serious study of Marxism or of revolutionary history, and therefore distorting the entire analysis. And that's really a problem, right? Because you might hear, well, like communism or Marxism is incomplete on the women's question. But generally, people have not really studied revolutionary history enough to be able to make that assessment, right? And it generally ends in downplaying class and elevating gender or sex as if it's not divided by class, right? Or fundamentally a class issue as well. So again, we would argue that women's oppression originated with private property, the family, and the state, right? And specifically in the development of the right to ownership over the means of producing all wealth and necessities in society. So if you look at how women's oppression originated, you see that it really came up with the genesis of private property, right? In many ways, women were one of the first forms of private property, right? In slave society, ancient slavery, slavery was sort of tested out on women before being applied more broadly. So we see that there is this common, origin of women's oppression and class oppression. But what maintains women's subordination today? Well, in an exploitative, capitalist society like ours, ideas from previous modes of production are maintained, right, in our cultural and our social institutions. So one example of this might be, sort of feudal ideas about women's subordination being maintained in religious institutions. But it's not limited to religion, right? It's in our entire culture, all of our social institutions. Whereas in a semi-feudal society, perhaps like India or the Philippines, women's subordination is maintained in a much more severe form. So we know that we cannot limit the oppression of women simply to men's ideas, right? But there is a class root that we have to get at. And so therefore we're led to the question of what is women's primary enemy, capitalism or patriarchy? So Anuradha Gandhi here, who I would recommend everyone read because she really synthesizes this well, but she argues that patriarchy and capitalism are not separate systems, right? There's no separate ruling class for patriarchy, right? However, patriarchy takes different forms depending on the type of society that you're in. So patriarchy looked different in ancient slavery, and that looked different in feudalism, and it looks different than it does today. So there's really no separate enemy for patriarchy, right? We can't just say we're going to put all women, regardless of class, nation, etc., on one side and all men on the other, and we're going to overthrow all the men, right? There's just no sense behind it. So that's why we also look at, is our struggle intersectional or comprehensive, right? Because this is another problem, right? And when we're looking at these moments, like after October 7th, we have to sort of be able to understand what the root cause and the primary contradiction is. So whereas intersectionality sees our world as organized under like separate interlocking systems of oppression and flattens the difference between gender, race, class, etc., we maybe see this more as a comprehensive struggle, which understands the primacy of class struggle, as well as class in developing and maintaining other forms of oppression, and specifically taking very seriously the fight against national and gender oppression, but ultimately aiming to unite all torrents of opposition against our common enemy, right? Because you cannot just have sort of women over here fighting patriarchy, LGBT people over here fighting homophobia and transphobia. That's not going to result in a serious change. What we need to do is identify our common enemy, the root cause that's maintaining our oppression, and unite all torrents of opposition against them. So I have a quote here from, an activist in the Philippines who says, there is a point towards recognizing that all struggles are interlinked. But the way that they see it is that it's not just that their identities happen to intersect at certain points, right? But it's that they're sort of tied together by your class. And that we have to understand that, gender, race, class, etc., ability are not just all the same thing with a different name or a different content. Gender and sex are something that developed at a specific point in history. Race and nationhood developed at a specific point in history, as did class oppression. And you need to be able to understand them as separate things and understand what ties them together and what their substance is, okay? So I also wanted to include this quote from Safia Bukhari, because I think it also shows how this question applies to the national question, right? So she says that genuine women's liberation for Black women will only come about with the liberation of Black people as a whole, right? And so this is not to downplay the struggle of Black women against patriarchy, in the US as well as in their own communities, but just to say that, right, we have to understand how the question of women's liberation is linked to the national question, like we see in Palestine right now. How can Palestinian women ever be emancipated without the emancipation of the Palestinian people as a whole from the Zionist occupation? But then also here, how can nationally oppressed people here, nationally oppressed women, ever be free without the, freedom from national oppression, etc.? So, just sort of wrapping up here before we get into a discussion, we see that the ruling class shapes exploitative relations like patriarchy, but that only a proletarian revolution can really fulfill the core aims of feminism, right? Because it unites all torrents of opposition against our common enemy, which benefits from maintaining an exploitative society and dividing people across these different lines and maintaining these kinds of hierarchies. And because the question of women's emancipation is a political question, because it also has to do with who has ownership over the means of producing all wealth and necessities in society. Because who has ownership over that is who has ownership over the state and is who is able to set the tone for everything in our society. And so that is the crucial question. And that's why, right, to be revolutionary, when we say revolutionary feminism, proletarian feminism, it's not just about, oh, we're going to try and be as left as possible and sound all radical. No. Revolutionary means that you have to be about the seizure of political power, because that is the core question, right? It's a political question. And yeah, I think this already went over what we talked about, but basically this little quote here on the right, that under imperialism, imperialist oppression is class-based, it's not gender-based, right? There is the gender oppression of patriarchy, but the bigger oppression is the one perpetrated by imperialism. And the women in government, the women in the occupation, right, in those positions are part of the oppressive class. And so we have to be able to identify the ruling class, the oppressive class, and separate friends from enemies. So that being said, I am going to pass it back to Gabby, who is going to lead us in a group discussion, since most of us here are probably involved in the movement or organizing in some way and have a lot to add.
All right, thank you so much, Esperanza. How are y'all feeling? Good? Yeah, all right. We want to deepen our understanding and analysis based off of our presentation as a group. And so we provided some questions here for y'all, and hopefully if we have enough time, we can also answer any general questions or comments as well. So our first question is, how can we combat imperialist feminism as organizations within the imperial core?
Solidarity.
Solidarity, right on, yes.
What you guys are doing, educating.
Yeah. Solidarity, educating,
I feel like it can be hard because, when you're criticizing like a woman in power, who people are like, oh, she's empowering, she's a girl boss, like people are really sensitive about that. And it's like, oh, you're being misogynistic, but I don't know, all I can think of is like to just push back against that and just be like, yeah, like Kamala Harris is not our, friend, and not our ally, and very much like it's just different flavors of imperialism. So I think just pushing back against that, yeah.
I agree, definitely pushing back against like the imperialist propaganda as organizations. That's a great point. Go ahead.
I'd say too, combating the idea of like allyship as a performative thing, and being to further the solidarity idea is like as a comrade in someone's struggle, rather than being a performative ally that stands outside of somebody's struggle.
Yeah.
To be able to relate, even if it's not yours, to relate that and see that their freedom is also yours.
Okay, so we're gonna go.
As we mentioned, because our comrade Gigi, she's not here today, but our last time mentioned just having a strong political line as an org, so this doesn't happen. So attacking any imperialist propaganda, any liberalism, you have to attack it right then and there, and you guys just have to struggle out. So just make sure you guys have like a strong political line.
Right.
It also sounds a little redundant, but actually being anti-imperialist and organizing is the way that you combat imperialism. The power of organizing and being in the struggle, and developing lines on anti-imperialism and being in solidarity with anti-imperialist movements across the world. So yeah.
Yep. All right. So our next question is, what discourse have you heard that promotes the line of imperialist feminism?
I think one of the biggest issues where I see a lot of people who think that they're or claim to be anti-imperialist fall apart immediately is the issue on Iran. It was a huge color revolution movement that was woman life and freedom, and a lot of what we conflate as freedom is already informed by imperialism. So who is it to say that because Iranian women might wear hijab, that they are less free than women in the West because they don't. In the same way that, you could look at what is the value of freedom. So in Iran, women have access to become doctors. They have better comprehensive gynecological care. They're not dying at the rates that women in the United States are from pregnancy. But what we view freedom as is the freedom to be sexy, the freedom to be sexualized, as if that's empowerment. The same thing with the quote unquote female genital mutilation. We will call it that if it's in another country, but here you're free to get a BBL, you're free to get liposuction because you're free to do it. And it's this idea that if it doesn't look like Western feminism or Western freedom, that it's not true freedom. The same thing, I think Tommy mentioned with the pride flag. The pride flag does not represent all queer people. I personally think that flag's ugly as fuck. But it's also based on the United States flag. It has the stripes for a reason. And so to say that, if this pride flag isn't up here, that means there's no queer people or no people who are okay with their queerness or communities that are supportive of queer people is just categorically untrue. And so I think people constantly need to reevaluate what is it that you think freedom looks like, and how are you imposing that on other people?
That was excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. And just a little note to add before other folks go. I know as an organization we haven't developed our line on Iran yet, but it's my opinion that Iran provides really the most material support for the Palestinian resistance that we've seen, actually ever. And in terms of the question of Iran or the broader axis of resistance, I think as revolutionaries, as anti-imperialists, we should come together and develop more politically coherent lines around, thinking strategically about the furtherance of struggle and who's actually, working to actualize that and who's providing material, foundations for that. Instead of looking, as Palestinian resistance, rather abstractly in terms of being oh yeah, the Palestinians are freeing themselves, purely by themselves, which is, the Palestinian resistance struggle is a Palestinian struggle, but it's also a struggle that's, supported and furthered by more than just Palestinians. And I think Iran is a place where we can question and develop, I wager, support around, that country as, one of the nations that's providing, the means for Palestinians to resist. So yeah, that's just a little piece that I wanted to say.
Thank you, T. Yeah, and in what ways can we protect our organizations from male chauvinism, which ravages our movement spaces? And we also want to mention that this does not exclude gender oppressed organizations like ourselves. So because male chauvinism can show up even within gendered oppressed folks.
Can you define male chauvinism? It's kind of weird. Performative.
Well, I think that talking about male chauvinism, right? Just the idea that men are superior, right? Or that men have some sort of right over women, right? To dominate women, or this sort of attitude of the sort of boys club stuff, right? And sort of excluding women. Just the attitude that develops from the belief in the superiority of men over women.
Yes.
I think it would be good to like have regular, deliberate, like I guess like check-ins within an organization that is like, you know, with comrades of all genders, and to like, you know, and maybe this could be with like other power dynamics as well, like race and ability and so forth, of like, because interpersonal like dynamics of identity like things are like bound to happen, and I know that I experienced them um, in my gender oppression with my male comrades. And so I think it would be, I don't know, to kind of normalize like speaking about it openly in a way that is like not just femmes initiating that, or you know, not just gender oppressed people initiating that, but male comrades initiating that and being like, oh, like, you know, is this happen? Like, because you know, these dynamics are so like subtle, if that makes sense. Like just normalizing talking about it.
I will add, kind of going off what was said earlier about like Kamala Harris. I've noticed that a lot of men take the opportunity to express their misogyny when criticizing women in like political positions or positions of power, like especially black and brown women. So it's almost like this slick way of saying, oh, well, it's okay to criticize them because they're the enemy. When in reality it just shows that they're just waiting and waiting for that opportunity to express their misogyny. So kind of walking that line of, yes, we should still criticize them, but it's curious how they always start using specific slurs for specific individuals that aren't translated to men. Right? Anybody can be an asshole, but why is it that you're specifically saying you're this, you're that, right? So that opportunism to be misogynist.
So I would also add to your point, to speak to your point, I think it's important for our organizations that we incorporate a Marxist tool of critique and self-critique. And this is so essential, and we practice this and rep them all the time, and it's just a way to critique each other and critique ourselves, and so that we can advance ideologically, politically, and as organizers. And I implore you all to use that even with your interpersonal relationships, but definitely in any organizational spaces.
I'm going to speak in like abstract about how, you know, this appears in women's movements or gender oppressed organizations where, you know, a lot of the times, you know, women may bring, you know, their partners into movement spaces, or might, you know, allow kind of, you know, this sort of male chauvinism to like kind of like subtly, you know, entrench itself in the organization. And also like there's, you know, oftentimes this this like desire to basically you know, allow like just actually, yeah, we shouldn't talk that much about like the origin of our organization in general, but yeah, I just want to say that like gender oppressed organizations and women's organizations are not, you know, devoid of, you know, whether it's male chauvinism, whether it's bourgeois feminism, or, you know, all these ways that, you know, male chauvinism entrenches itself through supposedly like feminist ways.
This is also kind of abstract, but I also feel like, you know, not just men, but like all genders, like there can be an impulse to like sexualize each other and like I don't know, just create like a culture of like taking from like compulsive dating culture and bringing that into our spaces, where it can just feel like it feels misogynistic, and also like you know, women do it too. Like I noticed this in the queer community, where it's like a lot of objectification And that feels like it comes from, you know, patriarchy and capitalism. And so, yeah, just like naming that and like, yeah, I don't know, just like working with that too.
Yeah, and I will just briefly say, because I think someone mentioned like the plastic surgery and then this like sexualization. That is a line that our org has also holds, is sort of against this sexual commodification and against this like liberal idea that it's sort of inherently like freeing or empowering, or even that we're necessarily doing it like out of our free choice.
Right.
So like I am happy that you brought that up, because that is also one form in which imperialist feminism manifests, is like in the justification of the global sex tourism industry, which primarily exploits nationally oppressed women.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of really wonderful comments have been made. I want to add that this point about the division of labor in this capitalist society that we're in, but then also within the organizations, comes back to how male chauvinism ends up getting expressed. We have all these concepts. A lot of people are coming into the movement with concepts of what is revolutionary action and what isn't. Some people are thinking of Che and Fidel exclusively. Not that they weren't revolutionaries, but it's not just holding a gun and making a speech. Leaves out a lot of the labor that in this society gets gendered as women or feminine, administrative work, childcare, all these social reproductive things, that within our organizations, we have to be not only like redistributing that labor and thinking about how that labor is distributed, but I mean, even in the question, there's a little bit of a like, how do we protect our organization, blah, 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 movement spaces. Half the organizing of the space happens before you're even like in the space, right? Like how is the space made? So making sure, if you're building the organization, you're building the space, is there space for people like with kids to come through and, be able to do their own thing, whether they're women or not women, right? Or if you're building a proletarian organization, are you doing it like during working hours? Like, and I've seen those basic kind of contradictions happen. And those kind of give an outlet for male chauvinism to start to emerge, or like those trends to start to emerge. And then kind of separately, or I mean, it's all interrelated, but kind of second point, to the point about, sexualization and also dating within the scene. My God, like, no, but for real, like, people use the word activism, and I think it's a major crisis. It's not a crisis necessarily that like we've generated intentionally. I think a lot of it actually comes from like folks being so alienated in other aspects of our society that like we find a movement space and it's like, oh, these are our homies. Like, we gotta be our revolutionary organizations are revolutionary organizations, right? Our social spaces are social spaces, and it's so like tempting and romantic to be able to like merge those two. Yeah.
Can you speak to that point?
Yeah,
just
sure.
For the men in here and all people in here, it's like our revolutionary spaces are not a dating pool. It's not. I know that we share a lot of similar interests with people. Maybe things can happen, but by and large, we need to make sure that we keep politics in command and not like like they say, principles above personalities. All these are super important if we really want to advance our movement.
Oh, I mean, that's totally the point. And that it's in this male chauvinism space, but like also in just like in general social things. It's like I end up encountering a lot of comrades where like their only time socializing is in our like working meetings, and it's like either can't do the working meetings, the socializing meeting. As a general question to everybody though, I'm very curious, and I don't want to derail yourself, but I'm curious if people have like kind of practical examples of successfully combating male chauvinism, and in particular, I've seen a lot where like male chauvinism ends up splintering the entire org, which which sometimes I think is the right move, but a lot of times it's like that's just off work happening.
I mean, I would suggest like, can there be like a male chauvinism like meeting, like check in, or just like let's make sure this isn't happening. It, like it has to be this like thing that is addressed, and maybe that's also the case with like racism or like other systems of oppression happening. But I don't know, because I just feel like a lot of times it falls on like gender oppressed people to say, hey, that made me feel uncomfortable, or like, hey, this is, you know, like crossing my boundary. And so it's like, can man comrades like kind of do that emotional labor as well?
Yeah.
I was like one of the first things that you said really stuck out to me because I was part of a community. Well, I'm part of a community where the majority of the members are not men, but most of the leaders are. And so just always kind of questioning that and looking at like who our leadership is and why, whether it's childcare access or really just anything. I mean, women are more likely to have autoimmune disorders, so like how is health a barrier? So just wondering, like, who are we propping up? Who are we willing to listen to and be leaders in those spaces?
We had an issue in our org where somebody brought up that there were too many men dominating the conversation in the discussion group, and one of the easiest things to do was take stack and time. Just made that, it's just like the simplest thing to do. And if the person who's timing and taking stack actually does the job, because the person who made the complaint also wasn't doing that. So it goes along with what you're saying, having good political line, and as other people saying, having discipline as well. But small little tools like that can even out who's talking and who's.
Last week, someone also mentioned the idea of like revolutionary authority and sort of like this, you know, structure and, you know, making sure that, you know, people know what the consequences are for, you know, letting male chauvinism occur in spaces, you know, what the consequences are for these things, so that, and that there's a structure and authority that is present and able to intervene in these issues. You know, structure is really important in an organization, and, you know, let's not forget that. And, you know, our organization is new in building these ideas and developing lines and building structure right now. And, you know, principle, structure, all of these, and discipline are last. I think we also wanted to mention criticism and self-criticism being baked into our process, because, you know, in general, like, we can't function if we sweep, you know, these things under the rug. And, you know, now we're having meetings where, you know, we include criticism and self-criticism within the meetings, and everyone is encouraged to reflect and offer criticisms and, you know, more importantly, like self-criticisms that are actually self-criticisms and actually criticisms. So, yeah, and it's really important that we develop that and practice that, even if it's uncomfortable, because that builds on to when things get harder, when the stakes are higher, better preparedness to address those things. So, yeah. I know we keep answering our own question, but we just wanted to like say these things to offer, like, you know, starting points for people to move as they organize.
All right, so we have one last question. What are some attributes of proletarian feminism which sets it apart from bourgeois or academic feminism?
I would say, like, historically, what I consider proletarian feminism is a very, like, physical thing, like, just thinking about, like, women's guerrilla movements. And so, like, that's not academic, you know? And that's, like, a huge part of what I think about, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Just how it's interconnected with class struggle, and how you know, that inevitably gives it a socialist types of you know, outlook, because without class struggle and all these issues, the national question, the race question, yeah, it's not gonna really come to fruition, I suppose.
I can add on. We see choice feminism within bourgeois feminism and academic feminism, as we talked about, like figureheads like Kamala Harris, or when people say, like we want individual autonomy versus a collective whole. So proletarian feminism is for all of us, rather than individualistic people trying to gain the same access as upper class or ruling class people have.
Alright, y'all. So I think we're a little. Are we still on time? We still on time? Does anyone have any like general comments or questions like to ask any of us?
Yeah, just a really practical question. This is a really wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Are these slides available either for the general public, or are you able to share them out? I would love to be able to reference them more.
So this is probably a good time to mention that one of our comrades, Sharon, back there, is passing around a sign-up sheet. So if you just want to make sure you provide your email, and then if we talk and decide to release the slides, we'll definitely send them out. Yeah, it's just because we're a done sent organization, so we just want to make sure to talk about all that. So.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering if y'all have a line on the question of choice in sex work. Like, do you think there is choice in it, or do y'all believe it's all kind of coercive? I mean, or do y'all?
Who wants to start?
Who wants to start?
I mean, maybe you don't have a line in it.
So, okay, so we would argue that the vast majority of people in the global sex trade are not there by choice. The very few people that are often have their narratives promoted as the narrative about the sex trade, prostitution, sex work, whatever you want to call it. And the majority of people who are put into that situation because all their other choices have been gone are their narrative is ignored, is stigmatized as swerfs or turfs or any other earth. I don't know how many other are. But also, that if you just look at look in any area, whether globally, in a country, or even in a neighborhood, who are the people that are getting into prostitution? It's typically the people who have the least choices. Those with the most choices aren't typically the ones going into this. So we also hold the line that, prostitution, but specifically sexual commodification, needs to be abolished, right? On the left, we talk about decommodifying water, housing, right? Oh, you commodify housing, look at all the problems. But yet we are so afraid to talk about what happens when you commodify a woman's body or commodify our sexuality, right? And we're also an organization of many people who survived the sex industry, but it just has not become our primary focus yet.
Yeah. We're a new organization, and there's a lot to talk about, and our organization is constituted of a lot of survivors of the sex trade, and many of whom are still involved, not by choice. So in general, I think because of our call to the Palestinian struggle right now, that's what we've been focusing on. But yeah, I think there's like what Esperanza said is like an accurate depiction of what our members think on the issue, and there's more that can be developed, more comprehensive analysis that we're hoping to work through and struggle with together. But yeah, we have a pretty firm stance. We have a firm stance. We have principles on anti-sexual commodification.
And I do just want to point out for the organizers in the room that we did not bring this issue up in our presentation. However, many people here tonight are curious about this question, right? Because we're thinking through how does gender oppression relate to imperialism? And so multiple people sort of ask, well, what about this? Or mention sexual commodification, or, mention sort of surrounding industries. So I do think it's important for us to not be afraid to address it head on, but develop and promote an anti-imperialist and proletarian line on it. So.
Any final comments or questions? We're good. All right. Well, we have a couple more slides for y'all. We just wanted to plug you in with some resources. The Palestinian Resistance Telegram is a very beneficial resource if folks want to get as much information as possible from the ground with developments that are happening in Gaza and the West Bank. And then also some further readings that our organization recommends. There's a list there. And then also stay connected, please. We love to continue this dialogue, and then also hopefully have some of y'all join us. We have a website, interimrevfem.com. We have Substacks, and we also have our email listed. So if you want to take a photo of that. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Of course, thank the people at Midnight Books and also at All Power Books for putting this together. Because they have consistently tried to promote, an anti-imperialist line on the women's question and address this issue. So we appreciate that.
Thank you so much, y'all.
Thank you.